This video needs to start with a couple key pieces of information. First off, I loved The Invisible Man. I think the emotional journey that Cecilia Cass goes on is incredibly well written. The scares are earned through careful building of tension and foreboding. The plot is well paced despite the lengthy runtime, and all of the performances are very convincing and effective. Honestly, it's nearly a perfect story, or at least a perfect reimagining of the titular character from the 1933 film. That being said, it has one glaring, but not fatal, flaw. The suit is utterly stupid and cannot exist, not with our current level of technology. This brings me to the second piece of information that needs to be addressed. I am not an expert in optics, or programming, or engineering, or really anything scientific. My thoughts on this are merely the thoughts of a layman, pointing out the rabbit hole of doubt and increasing frustration I embarked on in the course of a day, ending in the realization that one of the most important plot points in this film is complete nonsense. It doesn't ruin the movie, but I want to talk about it anyway, since I haven't been able to find anyone else on YouTube talking about this. I guess one last thing I should share is that while I'm no expert in these fields, neither is Leigh Whannell, the writer and director of the movie, so I don't feel too bad criticizing his decision to leave such a fundamental piece of the story completely unexplained and hoping nobody would think too hard about it. According to the special features, he did some research regarding the military's idea of how invisibility could realistically be achieved in the real world, which sounds just vague enough to me to amount to Googling some Wikipedia articles and calling it a day.
I did a bit of research in how invisibility could be achieved. Usually it starts with military tech. You know, they're developing some sort of camouflage for soldiers that allows them to be invisible.
It's also important to note that there are major story spoilers for the entire movie, so if you don't want to hear anything because you haven't seen it yet, then go watch it and come back later. I will be talking about everything, including the ending, and again, the movie is great, so I highly recommend watching it with a perspective untainted by preemptive knowledge. So, with all this prologue said and done, let's start with the detail that set this chain of events in motion. Shadows. Imagine, if you will, a normal person standing underneath a light source. The light is traveling downwards, and when it comes into contact with the person, who is not transparent, those specific light particles stop, and a corresponding area on the floor beneath the person is darker because of it. Or, if you weren't born yesterday, they cast a shadow. Windows do not cast shadows because they are transparent, allowing every light particle to pass through uninhibited and shine on the floor, assuming the glass is clean. While watching The Invisible Man, it suddenly occurred to me that Adrian should be at the very least casting a shadow, since he's really just a big conglomeration of cameras and projectors, not truly transparent. The light above him should still make contact with his opaque form and not reach the ground, even if every other piece of visual information is accounted for and replicated to achieve mostly transparency. But that's just it. He's only transparent in a sort of line of sight way. He's not literally transparent like a window. However, in the film, he does not cast a shadow, meaning that Adrian had to have figured out some kind of method of shadow cancellation built into the suit. This means, in my opinion, that the projectors are also casting light onto the ground in the perfect shape of his shadow to make it disappear as well. It sounds like I just explained why there isn't a shadow cast, but that actually creates even more problems later on. But let's go on to the big part of the problem. The cameras on the suit themselves. So, if you buy that the projector and camera system adequately captures and emits video images in perfect real time to not only achieve apparent invisibility but also negate all shadows on all nearby surfaces, then how do you camouflage the cameras themselves? Surely Adrian should just be a bunch of dots in the vague shape of a man running around, right? Well, this one's actually pretty easy to explain away, if you ask me. You could theoretically have the mesh that displays the projected image be filled with tiny holes that perfectly line up with the camera lenses, because at such a close distance to the lens, it doesn't take much of an opening to allow the full image to be captured. So I can buy that there's a very fine mesh over the whole suit to cover up the hundreds of small circles. However, think about that detail for a second. Hundreds of cameras. Have you ever edited HD video, even on a pretty decent computer? How many 4K video files can you overlap before the machine starts really struggling to handle the calculations and starts dropping frames or outright crashing the program? Have you ever tried 250 video files at once? You may have a space-age PC, but I doubt very much that many of you have a computer that could do this, if anyone on Earth even does. And I say the video would likely have to be 4K because this is reality that the suit is capturing and displaying in real time. It might even have to be 8K, but I'm not sure. Again, I'm not an expert, but even 250 cameras capturing 480p resolution would strain the hell out of any computer currently available on the market, and that doesn't include capturing. It only refers to playing it back. No simultaneous capture display function. This segues nicely then into the next topic, computing power. This is the big one. So here's where I really am going to show off how much of an expert I am not. However, I have a decent PC and understand some basic stuff about how computers work. Most important about computers is that they have limits to what they're capable of. Sounds like a yeah, duh kind of statement, but it's necessary for the point I'm about to make. I threw around the number 250 earlier for the number of cameras on Adrian's suit, but let's be nice and dumb it down to 50. Only 50 cameras recording in 4K in real time. One 4K image is 8,294,400 pixels. That's every single drop of color and definition in the image, which is why a movie in 4K at even 30 frames a second is a pretty large file. However, after some Googling of my own, which is fair because I think that's all Winnell did for the movie, I found out some interesting things about how the human eye works. We see in about 60 frames per second, give or take, and our eye's resolution is actually about 40 megapixels. For reference, 8K resolution is only 33 megapixels, so we are still being incredibly generous with our numbers concerning the suit. To recreate real-life visuals in the proper amount of detail, it would have to capture and instantly display something like 12K resolution 60 frames per second video. 8K equals one frame being roughly 33 million pixels. So with 12K, we're entering like the 50 million plus pixel region at this point. This accounts for one camera. And remember, we're being nice and saying his suit only has 50 cameras on it. 50 cameras, each one capturing 60 images every second that contain over 50 million pixels without lag. This is only the first part of the equation, but I want you to just try and imagine the workload put on whatever computer is processing this. Just this part of the operation. This computer is dealing with, and I swear to God I quadruple checked this, 150 trillion pixels per second, just capturing it and displaying it. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's consider the second part of this suit's functions. Projection of light to cancel shadows. So on top of the capture display function, there has to be a system to negate shadows as demonstrated in the film. Shadows are created based on the angle of where the light comes from, as well as the surface they hit, its angle and proximity to the subject, and so on. Therefore, in my mind, there would have to be a secondary, real-time program that measures all of these factors at all times and adjusts the projections accordingly to make sure the light that should get stopped by the suit appears to reach the floor anyway. This is a massive oversight, to say the least. Ask anyone who plays PC games regularly how difficult and expensive it is to run modern games in ultra settings with ray tracing on, and even that isn't photorealistic. And that's just one example of why this is ludicrous. As Adrian moves around, the position of the light source and the shadows constantly changes, requiring constant adjustment at a minimum of 60 frames per second in 12K resolution, not to mention proximity sensors relentlessly measuring the distance between him and any walls, ceilings, floors, people, vehicles, literally anything that a shadow can be cast upon. Which, newsflash, is pretty much everything on Earth. Does this mean a radar system? Or could it be built into the cameras themselves somehow? Either way, this process is secondary to the Herculean task already being undertaken by the capture display process, yet it has to be running in order to delete the shadows. Hopefully you're starting to see where this is going, but we aren't quite there yet. Again, anyone who games on PC will likely be familiar with how much heat is generated by your machine while you play a demanding game, to the point where the most hardcore players will invest in water cooling systems on top of fans, especially if they're overclocking or really trying to push the machine as hard as they can. This is because massive amounts of computations create a lot of energy that is represented by a rise in the temperature of the components, which can lead to significant and often fatal damage if not handled with a complementary and sufficient amount of cold. So if running Cyberpunk 2077 at ultra settings makes your computer heat up some, what in the world would 150 trillion pixels per second captured and instantly displayed, plus whatever calculations and projections and proximity sensors necessary for additional shadow cancellation due to the temperature of your machine? So we arrive now at the third problem: cooling the thing. If we can even concede that it's possible to compute everything else, it would create an extremely hot environment quickly. And it's not like you can cover the thing in fans. So the only reasonable explanation is that Adrian has outfitted some sort of liquid cooling system into the suit. Maybe liquid nitrogen? Is that even a thing? And we must also take into account the 98.6 degree base temperature of encasing a human body, which is likely going to rise due to the lack of openings and the physical activity that Adrian undergoes in the film. Now, I'm not here to propose solutions. I'm just here to point out how ludicrously advanced this suit would legitimately have to be in order to achieve true transparency. All right, cool. We've got an unfathomable amount of visual information, plus projectors and additional proximity calculations, and now a cooling system, and it all works. Sure, let's say we get to this stage. How do you power it? This is truly the final nail in the coffin for this absurd concept. Leigh Whannell said he didn't want the villain in the film to just drink a magic potion and be invisible, but when you break down what this suit must be doing, he might as well have just done that, because this is effectively magic. I know I keep repeating myself, but I'm not an expert on any of this stuff, and I don't know much about what sorts of methods the suit could be using to power itself. Most of me wants to just say it's flat out impossible, but part of me wonders about the natural electric current running through our bodies, or maybe friction generated by the man in the suit rubbing against it. But I just have no clue. I don't even have a crackpot theory. Please, if you have any theories, go for it. The movie shows him staying in her cell in a mental hospital for supposedly several days at least. So the battery life on this thing is just incredible to apparently run the world's most powerful camera and projector array, calculator, shadow radar, and liquid nitrogen cooling system. And you know, I honestly don't even care how expensive this suit would be to create. That's like the least problematic aspect of its existence. Plus, Adrian is a multimillionaire, so I'm sure he could swing it. Other small issues popped up for me as I was watching the film as well, such as when Cecilia pours paint on the suit and exposes him for the first time. This paint is quickly and easily washed off, and he can be completely invisible again, but how? How on earth could you possibly get something covered in cameras and projectors clean enough to be effectively transparent after having white freaking paint thrown all over it? Another thing was when it's raining later on. If a raindrop falls on a camera lens, I'm sure many of you have seen the effect this produces. It completely messes up the image, and if we're to believe that these cameras are capturing and displaying real-time video, how is it exactly that raindrops don't affect it in any way? Now, that was a lot, and I want to state again that I love this movie, and it needs this suit in order for it to function, so I hope my thoughts didn't ruin anybody's opinion of the film. It is a great movie, a beautiful story, and a very memorable piece of art about an important and potentially controversial subject. I think Leigh Whannell did a wonderful job in showing respect to victims of abuse and showing what they go through, which is why I think the emotional side of this story is basically perfect. Anybody out there with an intimate knowledge of how these systems work, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I've brought up in this video. I really think, despite the strong story and excellent acting, that the suit's feasibility is a pretty big flaw with the film. If you don't think too much about it, like I clearly did, then it probably won't affect you, and I truly hope that I didn't ruin this movie for anyone. I would be happy to watch it again, and likely will in the future. I want to leave you with some thoughts about what science fiction truly is to me. In my opinion, the best science fiction movie I've ever seen is Jurassic Park. Michael Crichton crafted a masterpiece in sci-fi storytelling with this novel and movie, meaning he took scientific facts and established knowledge and pushed it one step further to create a believable, powerful story. The explanations provided by the characters on how they brought dinosaurs back to life were completely understandable and sounded like they could be achieved in the real world, and having Alan Grant, Ellie Sattler, and Ian Malcolm be experts in their fields and still amazed at what John Hammond had been able to create went a long way toward legitimizing the possibility of it actually happening. Crichton explained just enough to make it make sense, but not so much that he started using alienating pseudoscientific jargon to falsely elevate the concepts. He used a prototype tour designed to cater to children to lay out exactly how they had done what they'd done in a way that was reasonable, using language anyone could follow and believe. Even when Grant asks how they interrupt the cellular mitosis, or when Malcolm questions all the dinosaurs being female, the answers given are grounded in real science, but without any specifics that could lead to plot holes. The reason this all works is because most people in the world simply don't understand genetics to the level necessary to contradict the explanation. Clearly, we haven't brought them back to life, so it's technically impossible right now. However, the movie could lead you to believe that it really is as simple as finding mosquitoes trapped in amber, extracting the blood, and filling in the genome sequence with some of today's creatures. And this is so because of how careful and thorough and thoughtful Crichton's writing approach was. This is also why every movie afterward falls short and often disappoints, because any further developments are still based solely on this first principle. It's just kind of juggling the same ideas over and over, but with different paint jobs and human dramas, rather than conjuring up the next big idea, like Crichton was able to do. It may come off as random, but I bring Jurassic Park up because The Invisible Man has a sci-fi element that goes completely under the radar, because Whannell did not elaborate enough. There's a very fine line between not enough and too much information. Both of these extremes could lead to plot holes or expose contrivances or ignorance. That's my problem with the suit and the lack of explanation. It feels like ignorance that isn't talked about in the hope that the audience won't notice. I really feel that the ending scene where Cecilia confronts Adrian in his house could have been used to mitigate this issue that I had. Everything that happens could have still happened, but part of Adrian's God complex and narcissism could have been to explain some of the development of the suit to her, and therefore to us. She could have asked him why he even made the suit in the first place, gaining some needed character on him. He might have answered that he was developing it for the military. He then could go on to talk about the problem with negating shadows and what he did to combat that, or address the coolant or battery issues. Propping himself up as a genius who was able to figure out and perfect such a terrifying and powerful piece of technology, it would have fit his character to gloat about how great he is to invent such a world-changing thing, and then perhaps to fit it into the ruse and lament that his brother used it to torment her when it was supposed to be a force for good, or perhaps the linchpin to their lifelong happiness and financial security together as a couple. I don't mind that this scene wasn't used this way, but I just wish that there was an explanation somewhere about how the suit works, because a lack of any explanation leads to curiosity. And for some people, especially pedantic YouTube dicks like me, scrutiny and potential criticism. At any rate, I hope you still like this movie, and I hope that this was interesting to you. Please feel free to tell me off in the comments or enlighten me with your knowledge if you are indeed an expert in one of these fields. I would be very intrigued to read them. Thank you, and have a good day.